follow that. Um, Thanks, Clarissa, and thanks, Simon, for what you said about Christina. I agree, I hardly knew her, but I was shocked and saddened when I heard about it. So what it must have been like for her much closer friends, many people, I can't imagine. Very, very sad. I'm going to begin my talk, as quite often video talks begin when they're on the internet, not with my first point, but with an advert. But it's not for random stuff, it's going to be for libertarian books. And I start with another piece of glumness, because the author of this, Andrew Ian Dodge, also died prematurely. Not as prematurely as Christina, but he really did have another 25 years of fight left in him. But he died. Again, I don't know what it was. He was getting a bit fat, whatever. When he was alive, I used to tease him for being a shameless self-promoter. But I miss him. I really do. I used to say to him, there's less to you than meets the eye, isn't there? And things like that, sarky remarks of that kind, which I rather regret now. But the good news is he wrote a book called Statism Sucks. And if you'd like to read a book called Statism Sucks, you can. He wrote it. Look it up on Google, you will find it. You probably won't have to pay very much, but at least he wrote it and he finished it. Here's a more sophisticated version of the same sort of thing. This was dished out at the Liberty League Freedom Forum approximately this time last year. And it's edited by, this is the only book in this pile that's edited by somebody rather than just written, by a man called Tom G. Palmer. I was very impressed by him when I heard him talk. I'd already been impressed by all the roaming around the earth and writing on the internet that he does in the cause of libertarianism. But he said something particularly impressive, which got my attention, and I've thought about it ever since. He said, the world as a whole is getting more libertarian. Now, what he meant by that was that everyday life for people is becoming more and more a matter of freedom, property, they have more of it, and that they are entitled to do with it what they please, and they are less and less inclined to bully each other with violence. They don't bully their children. Teachers don't bully their children as much as they used to. Life is becoming, regular life, ordinary life, is becoming, in that sense, more and more, as we would call it, libertarian. And that means, Palmer said, that libertarianism is the claim that should apply to politics as well. And when we say that, we are, as it were, working with the grain of society. You couldn't really live the life that Tom Palmer lives if you weren't something of an optimist, because the man's relentlessly energetic. And this was just one of dozens of occasions when he's spoken to rooms full of people who either were libertarians or were interested in finding out what it was. I understand that this room contains quite a few people here who wouldn't call themselves libertarians in our sense. They might in some other sense. That's fine. Let me briefly say what I and Tom Palmer and Andrew Dodge and all the rest of the people who wrote these books think it is. Very briefly, liberty, but that's a problem, because what do you do when my liberty clashes with yours, when my desire to use this room to address you clashes with your desire to have a noisy drink over at the bar? How do we settle that? The answer is property. Somebody owns this room. Simon hired it from them. So liberty, property, and then consent, already mentioned in the remarks that Simon made about Christina. The principle that more and more of the things that happen in the world should happen with the consent of all those present. It's not enough that you're outvoted. That's not good enough. You ought to be able to say, as an individual, I mean, if you were to think now, I don't like this person, he's a pompous twat, I'm going, you ought to be allowed to go. The fact that you might be outvoted, to hell with it, doesn't matter. It's got nothing to do with anything. Your right to leave is the sort of starting point. And bad news, our right to chuck, not mine, but Simon's right to chuck you out if you're misbehaving. In other words, consent, everything that happens in the world, that's the libertarian fantasy, if everything could happen with the consent of all those involved. Now, sometimes this consent might be rather grudging. It might be the case of choosing the least scummy job that you could get in the town that you don't really want to leave because it's your town. And you take the least worst job you can get with the least obnoxious boss that you can find. But anything is better than that obnoxious boss simply telling you where you work and what you have to do. Anything's better than slavery. Any choice is an improvement on no choice, and the more choice there is, the better. So that's what I mean when I say libertarianism. Okay, on with the adverts. This is a book called Medina in Birmingham, Najaf in Brent, Inside British Islam. It's written by a friend of mine called Ines Bowen, who works for the BBC, by the way. And she was responsible for some of those radio programs about Hayek versus Keynes. You remember those? Maybe not. But they were very interesting. I don't know quite how she's not one of these people who makes a point of telling you exactly how brilliant she is all the time. So I'm not sure exactly how completely we have her to thank for that stuff. But certainly she was heavily involved in those things. And she wrote a book because she wanted to know about British Muslims. Now, if you look in this book and look for the bit where it says what it all means and what we should do about it, you will search in vain. It doesn't contain anything like that. It is simply a description of who the Muslims of Britain are, what their various name, what the brand of Muslim they are, in what numbers, where they live, what sort of connections they have to foreign Muslims in other parts of the world. And it's very factual, and she's now making her way in the world as now one of the leading experts on British Islam. And this book is now getting its way onto academic reading lists, and whenever anybody in the BBC wants to do a report about it, something Islamic, they tend to get in touch with her, run it by her. So there's a case of a libertarian. This is not a woman who spends her whole time with a big sign saying I'm a libertarian, but if the question comes up in the pub afterwards or something, after a day editing stuff for the radio, that may emerge. And same applies to this book. This is called the PR Masterclass, and it's by Alex Singleton. It's a brilliant book, and what's so clever about it is that he tells you everything he can think of that he wants to tell you. One of the fears that experts wrongly have about telling everybody how they do it is that they think that by the time they've written the book completely with everything in it, you will know how to do it. This is as wrong as believing that if you're Jascha Heifetz, who was a brilliant player of the violin, that Jascha Heifetz believing that if he'd written a book called How to Play the Violin, and everybody had read it, they would all then be as brilliant at playing the violin as Jascha Heifetz, which of course is not true. I'm making a quite profound point about the nature of knowledge here. Those of you who know your Hayek will recognise some of the points I'm making. But the point is, this is not a book where he's holding back expertise. He tells you everything he can about how to do PR. And quite a lot of his potential rivals, as the writer of the book about PR, did make the mistake I've just alluded to. They thought they might give away too much. Not a chance. And this is a very good book. Now, I'm not suggesting you should go out and read this book, although I don't think you shouldn't. It's a good book. But what I'm saying is, here's another person, another libertarian who's doing very well in the world, and he's written a book. And again, if somebody says, so Alex, what do you think about the world? The word libertarian would probably crop up. Here's another interesting man, Dominic Frisby. He's written 2 books to my certain knowledge. One is about Bitcoin, very interesting indeed, highly recommended. This is the one before, it's called Life After the State. The man's a libertarian. He's also a stand-up comic of some considerable ability. He's not quite in the top, regularly on the TV, but he's pretty close to it. And he also does lots of voiceover work. I often get denounced by my fellow libertarians for my interest in comedians, but I think it's a very, very interesting job. I don't think it's an accident that a lot of comedians sidling into politics from comedy, because if you're a comedian, you have to communicate, you have to hold your audience, and making strangers laugh, well, it's not something I'd be comfortable trying to do. Being serious is much easier. Being funny, now that takes a lot of ability and a lot of savvy and sensitivity to who you're talking to. And he's one of these people. He can do it. This is a book which I'm mentioning out of guilt, because I blagged this for free on the promise that I would review it. I still haven't done that. Mr. Hunter Lewis, I'm very sorry. I apologise. What I really, apart from the fact that I owe the man some attention, this and another book he wrote, I can't remember even what it's called, but what I love about this book is the title, Crony Capitalism, which I think sums up a great deal about what we don't believe in and what we're nervous about. We believe in real capitalism, the right kind of capitalism. What we don't like is the idea that capitalists can buy the government. And one of our reasons for objecting to a big state is precisely that it's going to get bought up by the rich. That's what happens. The usual objection to crony capitalism is to say, well, that's bad, so make sure we can get rid of crony capitalism by getting rid of capitalism altogether. That's a cure worse than the disease. But if there are people present who think we like capitalism because we lust for the day when we'll be rich enough to buy the Ministry of Agriculture and be paid fortunes to grow worthless food or whatever it is, that isn't how we see it. And I think the phrase crony capitalism is getting around, and I'm very glad about that. Here's another book that I like a lot. It's called How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life. I think the world has been waiting for this book for a long time. It's not because Adam Smith can change your life, but because it's a bluffer's guide to the other Adam Smith book. Most of us know The Wealth of Nations. Some of us may even have read quite a lot of it. A few of us know that he wrote a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is about how people operate in groups and how they pursue the esteem of their friends and not just money. They're not in it just for the money. It's quite wrong to say that the libertarian idea of freedom is that everybody should, or does for that matter, pursue profit in the narrowest and most Philistine of senses. Adam Smith, more than most, was well aware of those truths, and here's a book that summarises the theory of moral sentiments very quickly. I heard a marvellous talk by Russ Roberts recently. Somebody mentioned the ASI, that stands for the Adam Smith Institute, which is a think tank not at all far away from here. And he told a good story, which is one of the reasons I'm waving books in your face in the talk he gave. He didn't talk about this book, he just mentioned it. He talked about what I'm talking about, how to do libertarianism. He probably did it better than I'm doing it. But he said, somebody came up to him recently and said, I'm going to write the book, one book, and it's going to blow the whole argument out of the water. It's going to spread libertarianism in all possible directions, and we're going to win the argument, and that's going to be it. And Russ Roberts said, you're not going to do that. But write the book anyway, because what we need is not just the one book, the magic book that says everything and does everything. What we need is hundreds of books. That was his phrase. We need lots and lots and lots of books. By book, of course, I don't necessarily mean what I mean by a book, which is a pile of paper glued together at the side and covered in black ink. It could be something on one of these toys, one of these gadgets. The concept of a large argument with lots of evidence attached to it. I think that's here to stay. I think it's a very good idea. I think if books didn't exist, they'd have to be invented. And that's one I recommend. How Adam Smith Can Change Your Mind, an unexpected guide to human nature and happiness. It's also actually quite a good guide to how to be a libertarian. This is the final book I'm going to advertise. It's called The Rational Optimist by Matt Ridley, and it's probably the one that the largest number of people in the room have already heard of and know about. The interesting thing in that, well, there are a lot of things that are interesting, but I want to pick on that word optimist. One of the now I'm getting to point number one. After all that preamble, a bit like Schubert's Unfinished Symphony, where the slow bit at the beginning is one of the most wonderful pieces of music ever written. And well, we shall see. The basic point I want to tell you about the libertarian movement is that I'm going to be switching unpredictably and randomly between how the libertarian movement is and how it ought to be. And the reason that I'm going to do that is because I basically think it is how it ought to be. I think the libertarian movement is all right, and there's nothing wrong with it that the movement being 10 times bigger wouldn't greatly improve. There are plenty of situations in life where you confront a group of people trying to do something, and it's quite clear they're doing it the wrong way. They're not making all the right moves. They're wasting their energy. They're getting it all wrong, and they need to stop doing what they're doing, and they need to do something else quite distinct and different. Now, that is not my opinion of the libertarian movement. I think we are doing all the right things. We just aren't numerous enough and energetic enough and inventive enough and clever enough, but we're setting about it the right way. And so therefore, later on in what I'm going to say, I'll be telling you how to be a libertarian. That will double up as a description of how libertarianism actually operates. This is how it works. If you want to be a more efficient libertarian, this is what you should do. If you want to know what the efficient libertarians already do, this is what they do. I'm optimistic about the libertarian movement in that sense, that I think it's doing its best, it's pointing in the right direction, it's making as many as it can of the right moves. And what it's doing is what I tried to do 5 minutes ago. It's basically repeating and repeating and repeating the fundamental libertarian message, which is the mixture of liberty, property, consent, and the good results that follow from all of those principles being taken seriously. And I'm also optimistic, talking of good results, I'm also optimistic in another sense, which is that I think the libertarian movement has, looked at historically, accomplished very great things. Of course, it's a matter of opinion when you think the libertarian movement started, but personally, I'm with Richard Carey, sitting over there, in believing that there is a pretty basic connection between what we're saying and what the Levellers were saying. Now, there was a wonderful phrase Richard used in one of his talks about this, where I said the left had stolen the Levellers, and Carey said, well, that's not quite right. It was more a case of the left homesteading the Levellers. The point is they'd been ignored. Very few people knew what they'd said at all. And certainly the classical liberals, who are in some ways our intellectual ancestors, had forgotten about the Levellers. They'd found them a sort of embarrassment, these crazy 17th century Puritans who marched naked through the city of Lichfield, or was that the Quakers? I can't remember. But they were a pretty unruly lot, the Levellers, and they got into trouble. Lilburne, the nearest thing they had to a leader, was in prison and all that kind of thing. And I think that that's part of our movement. They're the libertarians of their time, the proto-libertarians is a phrase I've heard recently. I think that's exactly right. The reason they sound different to us is because they were dealing with different questions. Again, Richard's a very good person to talk to on this. Our question tends to be actually it's the question that Simon alluded to in his very kind introduction just now of me, where he said, where the question is how should government be done? And our answer is, well, as little as possible. But in the 17th century, the question was, who should be the government? Which is a different question. And that's why the Levellers sound different to us. It's because they had different questions to face. And of course, another question they were deeply embroiled in was, what does God think about all this, which we tend to put to one side nowadays. Not everybody in the world does that, but in a secular country like Britain, that question tends to be treated as a private matter rather than a public issue. But of course, it was anything but private matter in the 17th century. Now, but what did these libertarians, or whatever they were, achieve? Mayumi attended a talk I arranged. I think Richard gave the talk. And she said, so if the Levellers, it was a talk about what actually prevailed politically after the 17th century. It was about republicanism. It was about the ideas that did win from the English 17th century, and of course on into America. And Mayumi asked, so what happened to the Levellers? Now, I had one of those lovely moments when I hear the truth bursting out of my own face. It's a wonderful feeling. You didn't see it coming, you didn't expect it, but I realised that pretty much on the spot that where the Levellers' ideas had gone was into the Industrial Revolution, which, and there's quite a bit of a buzz of agreement developing among historians of all sorts of different political persuasions, that there was something ideological about the Industrial Revolution. when I say Industrial Revolution, I'm talking about the moment in history when the graph of human happiness and contentment and comfort and ease and wealth and satisfaction and premature death and all that, infant mortality, frightful dentistry, suddenly goes from this is how good things are, wow, and we're now living in that hurtling upwards graph of improvement. This is something Ridley writes about very vividly. This is why he's such an optimist, because the world's getting better. There's a wonderful piece recently alluded to on the internet called 17 Reasons Why the World Has Never Been in a Better State. And you can always point to people being miserable if you want to. You just got to, you know, crank up a website of any kind. You will see disaster. You know, if it bleeds, it leads, that sort of thing. But the truth is that life is getting better for the average punter on this planet at a hectic rate. And it's because of that industrial revolution, and what the historians on the left were saying is that capitalism was an ideological construct. And now what's happening is that the historians of the libertarian team are starting to say, yes, it was an ideological construct, and that's what made all the difference. That's what turned something which had been regarded as a menace to society, namely the invention of new labour-saving gadgets, into a respectable calling. I mean, you used to be executed for inventing a labour-saving gadget in, say, 1500. By 1700, you were getting the friendship of the king. You know, they managed to do a transformation of the prestige of these industrialists who were self-conscious and ideologically motivated improvers of mankind. They were better at it than the sort of people in this room, but that's what we're trying to do, and that's what they were doing, and they were doing it with the same kind of ideas. The essence of what they were saying was that a man's entitled to do what he wants with his own property. And if that means he's invented a new way of spinning cotton, well, so be it. He's entitled. He should be allowed to do that. Yes, we understand that puts people out of work, but the long-run benefit to humanity will be beyond calculation, and that's all true. Including the bad news, you know, the people being out of a job. But that used to be the only bit of the story that people talked about. And gradually that changed to the point where regular people are almost at the stage where they can afford to be rendered unemployed by new technology. Why? Because the new technology will create lots of jobs, and that's widely understood, which is why that graph of human happiness and contentment and wealth and, you know, number of hours you can watch TV and all that stuff is going up still, despite everything you read in the papers and on websites. So we have a long history, and we've done great things already, and it's easy to sort of bask in the glory of it. I mean, part of the point of these historians is to say we're doing fine, and that's partly my motive for mentioning it all. We are doing better than we realise, and you know, just getting together, having a drink, talking about it all is how you do it. That's how it works. And of course, all the new media in the 17th century, it was the printing press. Now it's the internet, but the principles are very, very similar. More recently, there has been another colossal victory for the libertarian movement, and that is that I want to be careful. I think it's dangerous to insult your opponents in intellectual debates. I don't want to attribute to people opinions they don't hold and views about history that are not exactly right. So it's a very easy trap to fall into. Try not to do it. When you're arguing with somebody, listen carefully to what they say and don't attribute to them opinions they don't hold. But Marxists in particular, I mean, I'm not saying all left-wing historians are Marxists by any means, but Marxists especially welcomed the contribution made by capitalism, as they called it, to human betterment. But there was a caveat. They were saying that at a certain point the capitalists had done their bit, they sort of self-destruct from their own contradictions, I'm summarising brutally, and we take over. That's the basic story. And we do progress better. With us, there's going to be even more smoke billowing out of the factory chimneys. There's going to be even more stuff. There's going to be even more industry. The graph is going to shoot upwards more than if we just leave those capitalists in charge of everything. That was the central claim of the Marxists. And for a long time, a watered down or diffused version of that idea suffused the rich Western world. But, and people argue about the date, but it was around 1960 when progressives, people who believed in nationalisation, planning, the sort of stuff that had won the wars, that, you know, they stopped believing in industrial progress and started denouncing it. They started to say it was polluting, it was evil, it was going to ruin the weather. And that story has grown and grown and grown in volume and force. It's had a lot of effect. Now, I don't want to say that this was a great victory for the libertarian movement in the sense that we have completely defeated the environmental movement. Quite the reverse. We've got decades of cleaning up to do there. But, and this is a point about debates generally, this switch from industrial progress to more like industrial denunciation conceals a huge surrender by our opponents. They have surrendered the torch of progress and they've handed it to us. Most surrenders in intellectual debates are not, they're not like, you know, the Japanese handing over their swords on an aircraft carrier with lots of broadcasters and reporters talking about it all. That doesn't happen. Intellectuals don't say, by gad, I've seen the error of my ways. You were right, I was wrong, I've been wrong for decades. Oh, terrible, but at least I can apologise and admit that you were right. That is not what happens. That is not how intellectuals lose arguments. How they lose arguments is they change the subject completely. And sometimes the subject is changed so completely that the world just doesn't see that they've lost a huge argument. But they have. And all of this is designed to tell you that from where I sit, the libertarian movement has huge momentum and is doing very well. If you want further proof about this, here's an illustration. This is not proof. I mean, it's just an anecdote, but it's an amusing one, and it illustrates my opinion very well. So I'm going to tell you about it. It's an article called "The Power of Bad Ideas," and it's written by somebody who calls libertarianism market fundamentalism. That's because he doesn't like it, and he wants to say that we're suicide bombers. He doesn't actually say that, but he wants to hint that we're that kind of freak. And he asks questions like this: why are free market ideas so durable if they are so obviously wrong and destructive? That's his question. And the point is, from where he's sitting, he's losing. You know, we are everywhere. These bloody market freaks are all over the place. And from where he's sitting, don't forget, virtually all of business is a great big conspiracy against his opinions, because it's done by people who more or less believe in trade in one way or another. And it's very interesting what his answer is. He says, market fundamentalism taps into our individualism, our independence, our conception of freedom, our sense of self, and indeed our very ethos. I think we've got into this man's head. I don't know about you. I mean, just change the market fundamentalism bit, and I think he's ours. You know, it's like one of these horrible sort of stories in Darwinian evolution about some sort of parasite that's got into his brain. The man is explaining that trade, that individualism, liberty, consent, all this stuff is kind of embedded in human nature, and it sort of is. One of the things that Ridley talks about in this book, The Rational Optimist, is how the very emergence of humanity itself pretty much coincides with the emergence of trade, which has Marxists, because they've sort of talked about trade as a kind of rising succession of stages, have created an impression that in the far distant past there were completely self-sufficient human communities, but that's never been true. There've always been people trading along coastlines and on sort of caravan, old-fashioned ones with camels, not the Jeremy Clarkson caravans. There's always been that kind of bartering and trading and people keeping in touch. Yeah, the watch, you're looking at it, I can see that. And Ridley asserts that this is a very old story. And so therefore this man, Michael McCarthy, says that there's something in human nature which makes socialism impossible to do. This made me laugh out loud when I read it, because it so precisely mirrors the sort of things that our guys say about why collectivism is so devilishly prevalent, even despite its obvious, what's the phrase? Its obvious harm, you know. Collectivism is disastrous. Why is collectivism so durable if it is so obviously wrong and destructive? I've just rewritten that first question. And our answer again includes human nature. You know, we evolved to be to be hunter-gatherers or something, and you know the tribe has to stick together, and it won't tolerate dissent. And what I want to say is I think there's truth in both of these claims. I think human nature is interesting and complicated, and there are both collectivist urges and individualistic urges in our programming. And that leads me on to the next question, which is, well, how do you do libertarianism if you want to do it? If you just want to know how it's done and so that you can suppress it later, well, okay. The basic method of being a libertarian is that we apply to the libertarian enterprise the exact same methods we recommend for the world as a whole. This is a very strong and helpful fact about the libertarian movement. We're not saying, here's how you should behave, but when it comes to us doing our stuff, it's all quite different. That is not how it works. We actually believe for ourselves in the principles that we recommend for the world. And that includes individual activity. One of the banes of the libertarian movement, although I think it perhaps happens a bit less now, is people gathering in rooms like this and saying, we must do something or other that we're not doing. And this is terrible, why aren't we doing it? No wonder we're losing, no wonder history is passing us by, blah, 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 you know, misery, misery. And none of this is true. And the error comes right at the beginning with that ghastly phrase, we must. You've got collectivism, you've got must, compulsion. And this is just so wrong. This is not how to think as a libertarian activist. I'm not saying I recommend that you think differently and that most libertarians don't understand this and I'm preaching to the ignorant and stupid. No, most libertarians get this. All these people here know what I've said. They understand that. Matt Ridley says, I'm going to write this book. Russ Roberts said, I'm going to live the life I do. I'm going to do stuff that I can do and it's going to work. And so on and so on. Now, that's the first rule of libertarian activity. None of this we must bullshit. Do what you're going to do, and then what happens is that other people join in. So Simon here, for example, the absolute typical example of an excellent activist at work. He arranges meetings, and we all turn up, and then it turns out he's got a video camera running. So when I do a talk, I really prepare it quite hard, because I know it's going to be videoed. It might even turn up on the internet, you don't know. Fingers crossed. And I take the chance to sell some books. You know? In other words, I, as an individual, join in with the framework that he's created with these gatherings, and that's how it should be. Did I mention the phrase social atom? I don't think I did. That's a criticism we libertarians often get told about, that we are recommending a world of social isolation, where individual freedom is confused with social isolation. They're two completely distinct ideas. one of the most characteristic things you do with freedom is to flock together with your friends and have a good time. So absolute classic use of freedom. You choose what enterprises you will work for, what people you will make friends with, and what voluntary enterprises you will join and assist because you believe in it. And you'll make promises about what you'll do in these things, and you'll stick to those promises. And that is what freedom is typically all about, because that's what people are like. They're sociable as well as being individualistic. They hunt as well as, you know, doing their own trading stuff. And it's very important to understand that we're not making an argument against society on behalf of the individual. We're saying that the way to do society is by individual choice. But God forbid that we should put an end to society, to conviviality, to working together and achieving you know, combined effects and improvements in the world, the division of labour, you know, where one bloke makes some tiny little aspect of a new invention and thereby makes it possible for somebody else to concentrate on the bit that's new. Maybe he just does the, you know, just the packaging or the advertising or something relatively straightforward, while somebody else is inventing it. He's able to give his whole attention to that. Combinations of people coming together and producing that amazing lift-off in the graph. And we apply that same principle to the libertarian movement and how to do it. We absolutely do not work in isolation with each other. All the time we're looking for what I can do that will strengthen the activities of my fellow libertarians. I'm looking for chances to give these other libertarians a boost. And it's very important that I'm looking beyond libertarian home. It would be a great mistake if we were to say, here we are, this is libertarian home, what else are we going to do? That's straying into we must territory. No, don't do that. Think of libertarian home as part of the sort of wider ecological movement of the libertarian movement as a whole. And I've deliberately made it sound as big as I can by not just going all over the world now, but going back into history and saying there are fellow spirits of us. And so it's a very big thing. And when you set up your little operation, whatever it might be, you must think of it as contributing to and strengthening the activities of your fellow libertarians. So if one of them's written a book, you give it a plug. You read it, you review it, you say this is what's good about it, may even politely say this is what's bad about it. Next time do better, mate, you know, respectfully and all that. But that is how to be a libertarian, to think in combination. And the final point is so simple. This is a mistake I think socialists are more inclined to make than libertarians. And maybe this is my history, that I can remember a time when people of a free market persuasion perhaps made this mistake more often than they do now. They forgot to enjoy themselves. Libertarians will not thank you if you make a huge performance out of the sacrifices you made for the libertarian cause. The general opinion will be, well, that was a bit stupid, wasn't it? What, you burnt all your money, you spent it all on some madcap magazine or something that folded in the wrong way after 3 issues, and well, that wasn't very smart. What you must do is think how a little bit of money, you know, I don't know what that camera cost, but it's not much. But it's having a big impact. It is. Oh, it's rather a lot, is it? Not
to Simon, Brian, not to Simon.
This leads on to a slight subtlety. I wrote a blog posting on my own blog, which is all about how to have fun. And, you know, aren't kittens delightful, and look at these tower blocks and all that kind of stuff. It's just me having a sort of fully clothed wank, as it were. having fun. And I mentioned this business of yes, I mean the idea of the blog is that it's fun, but there are times when it isn't, and that is that I have a rule. I try to put something on the blog. I haven't done it yet today. I'm going to have to go home and do it. I try to put something on the blog that every day. And sometimes this is a bit of a struggle. It's a bit of a sacrifice. But I do it because if I do, guess what? It's more fun. And somebody sent me a marvellous link to a homily by, who's that comedian? I can't remember his name. Read my blog, you'll find it. Where he mentioned the folly of living in the moment. He said, no, you can't live completely in the moment. If you go head on for fun, you won't get it. You do have to make some sacrifices. You do have to exert yourself. Why? Because if you exert yourself, consume some resources, most of all some time and some effort, and you have some really good results, you will get the stuff that Adam Smith talks about in the theory of moral sentiments. You will get the esteem of your friends. They will tell you how wonderful they are. People like Simon will say that you're one of the best libertarians around. A bit of work went into that. I didn't just get him saying things like that by just doing nothing but having fun. I mean, I can remember I put it like this. I can remember when cutting and pasting wasn't some computer metaphor. It was the real thing. It was actually cutting and pasting, and that's how I did artwork. And so I'll end with that. Enjoy it. But think about enjoyment that you'll get in a week's time if you make a bit of an effort, a bit of a sacrifice, do something a bit difficult, a bit out of the ordinary, and then it works, and everyone says, never would have thought that was going to work, but my God, look at that now. I can remember the moment when my fantasy of walking into a conference with a sort of big suitcase full of Libertarian Alliance pamphlets finally sort of reached its moment of perfection just before the internet came on and blew the whole thing out of the water. And I just covered to about 3 tables with pamphlets. And I heard these libertarians of far greater grandeur than me wandering along this table and saying, fuck me, there are a lot of pamphlets here. And just one final point, I promise, one final point. This is something I have about halfway through my notes and I forgot to mention it. It's the difference between bread and babies. Now, the difference between bread and babies, there are many differences, but I want to isolate one particular difference, which is that if you slice a loaf of bread into lots of slices, you get something worth having. If you do the same to a baby, I'm afraid it doesn't work like that. And half a loaf of bread is still a loaf of bread. Half a baby is a disaster. I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not in favour of killing babies, that's my point. What you should do as a libertarian is things that, if you do all that you're trying to do, will be wonderful. But if you only do a fraction of what you're trying to do, it'll still be worthwhile. Now, as you can tell, I'm sure, I could just babble on forever about this stuff. I'm just going to stop and hope you had a good time.